Classical education is in the midst of an explosive renaissance. With almost 700,000 students in 900 schools, we find ourselves frequently discussing the shortage of educators. But perhaps the most pressing issue for us to discuss is what makes a good teacher. Today, that is the subject of our conversation. Welcome to the On Classical Education podcast. My name is Carol McNamara, and I am the director of the Great Hearts Institute and the National Symposium for Classical Education. Today our guest is Christopher Perrin. Chris Perrin is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of the Classical Academic Press, which is a sponsor of this podcast and of our National Symposium. Please join us now for our conversation with Christopher Perrin. Chris Perrin, thank you for joining us today on the On Classical Education podcast. And thank you also for agreeing to be one of our keynote speakers at the Great Hearts National Symposium for Classical Education in February 2026. I thought it would be good for our listeners and for our symposium attendees to find out a little more about your keynote address for February. And so thank you for joining us for the conversation today. Well, the title of your keynote, as you sent it to me, is Classical Education, What It Was and What It Can Be. And as you know, our annual theme this year is for the National Symposium is Classical Education in the American Experiment, the Declaration of Independence at 250. So we're joining the country in celebrating the 250th birthday anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And I know that we talked a little about how your keynote address would address that theme. Could you talk to me a little bit about like how you came up with that idea and how your topic will address our theme this year?
Sure, and thank you once again for the conference that you organize and put on. It's so valuable. Been so many years there, and just enjoy it immensely. Such a great gathering of interesting people who want to restore something that we've almost lost, but not quite. In one presentation I gave, it struck me that what we're trying to do in recovering classical education is something like reforestation. We're trying to plant trees again, because education is a slow process. As we know, someone has calculated it's like 16,000 hours between you're in school from, say, kindergarten to 12th grade, and beyond that when you go to college or graduate school. So it's a long process. And educators in the past have often talked about education like growing a tree, like a gardening, cultivating. We often we use this metaphor of cultivation to refer to the education of a human being. Aristotle a long time ago used the word eudaimonia, a kind of flourishing of spirit. A flourishing human person is what we're after as one of the grand goals of education, or raising up a child. And the ancient church father Irenaeus said, "The glory of God is a human being fully alive." So, to be fully alive, to be fully capacitated as a human being to do what humans do. And there's a long tradition of thinking about this. And there's a long, basically pretty grand, consistent consensus about this, that we use word and number, humans do. We, in a very unique way, use word and number to understand the world and ourselves, and to describe it, and to predict what might happen in the future. It's amazing what we can do with words and numbers together. And of course, together, the liberal arts comprise our exercise of capacity in word and number. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric, describing important ways we artistically use words. And arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, the traditional quadrivial arts describe how we use number to understand the cosmos. So this idea of returning, retrieving, recovering is at the heart of what we've been doing, what you've been doing at the symposium conference for several years. And that's partly the American heritage too. You
Right.
you described it as an experiment, and the founding of this country has often been described as an experiment. It was doing something new, but it was doing something new in a profound conscious conversation with the past. And the liberal arts that liberate and enable humans to do whatever it is they seek to do was in the minds of the founders. They knew the liberal arts. They had been trained in the liberal arts and the great books and the natural sciences up to that point. They had read the great books, say, of political philosophy. They had read Cicero. They had read about the Roman Republic. They knew about the Greek demos, and they had seen what had happened in the English monarchy, and they were reflecting on this and asking if there was a way that there could be a kind of restoration and synthesis at the same time. So there's a sense in which a restoration is a revolution, or maybe to put it the way Chesterton did, every revolution involves a restoration. He's playing with that word to revolve. When we go around, we come back to the place we started. And in order to make forward progress, there's a sense in which we have to go back in order to go forward. And so I think that's a paradox, but that's at the heart of important movements and experiments politically and otherwise in history. It's certainly the case with the progression of science. And so when I give this talk, I'm thinking about these matters. I'm thinking about the ways in which even America looked backwards to go forward. And now, 250 years since our founding, how do we look backwards to go forward?
So what would that classical liberal arts education have looked like at the time? What that you just mentioned, that the framers of our Constitution were steeped in reading the ancients, the Greeks, the Romans, Cicero, and they were well versed in ancient history and recent history for them. So what would that education have looked like? Was it widespread? Was it just at the university level? How did it inform the way that generation understood themselves and their role in founding this new country?
Yeah, it's a great and important question, because education is so determinative to what a country becomes and what the people are able to do. This is why there's always been debates about curriculum, because when a nation sets its curriculum, it's setting forth its ideal of what it means to be a citizen, to be prepared to serve as a citizen in that nation. And so in even before the founding, going all the way back to the colonists who came to the eastern seaboard of the United States, many had come from England. Most did, and they had received the traditional liberal education. Those who were privileged to get that education, they had that and they brought it with them. And so, before we called classical education classical, it was called something like just liberal education, the education that is appropriate to people who are free and that has the capacity to set them free and to keep them free. Hence, liberal arts. These are the arts that liberate us to be the best versions of ourselves and to use our minds and word and number to understand the cosmos, describe it, predict it, measure it, assess it. And so the liberal arts help enable us to create natural sciences. The natural sciences need the liberal arts in order for science, a body of knowledge to be gathered, say about chemistry or biology. The liberal arts provide what we need to do that. And also, of course, to create reflections on anything that involves human flourishing, including political science and political philosophy. And the founders read a lot of that and had studied that and thought about it themselves and wrote their own pieces of political philosophy. Say the Federalist Papers would be a great example. And in those Federalist Papers, you see educated people using their reading and thought and education to think in fresh ways about what a good society would be. And it was an experiment. They were doing something that hadn't quite been done before.
Right.
So a classical education is liberating in that sense too. It helps us to do something new, but based on the past. And so to describe their curriculum, we would be looking at the curriculum at the time, say in the 1600s and the 1700s, that existed in Britain and in France. And one way to do this, and I hope to do this in my talk, is to look at what de Tocqueville says in Democracy in America. Because here in early 1830s, de Tocqueville travels through the United States, and he observes, as a very well-educated aristocratic Frenchman, what he saw, and he compares it to Europe, and he says some pretty interesting things about American education. I'll just mention two. One is that there was a general education that was vastly superior in America to what he would see in Europe. It wasn't a deep education, but a good general education. People were literate and read, and they were motivated to do so. They were self-governing and self-educating to a large degree. But he also observes that there weren't many who had gone very far, because, and he makes some comments about why, because Americans were busy trying to carve out, places in this wild land at the time, and we had to work economically just to survive. There wasn't a lot of moneyed families that could just live a life of leisure like de Tocqueville could.
Right.
And so he notices this kind of egalitarianism, that education was spread wide, far, but it wasn't very deep, with a few exceptions. The founders would have represented some of those exceptions, which leads me to make this comment. A good liberal classical education was a rarer commodity in the 1600s and 1700s when you compare it to the population at large. But the egalitarian democratic kind of impetus of America wants to take anything that's really good and give it to everybody, at least give everybody the opportunity and the chance. Right. So it was Mortimer Adler who said this, about 50 years ago. He said, if classical education, if this classical liberal education is the best education for the few, like de Tocqueville,
right,
then it's the best education for all. So why wouldn't we try to democratize this education and give everyone the opportunity to go as far and as deep as they could in getting this great liberating education? So no doubt I'll be making some comments about that.
It's also interesting that de Tocqueville says that when he traveled out into the West, there was hardly a cabin, even a remote cabin, that didn't have a collection of Shakespeare's works on the shelf. So it was aspirational, even out in the woods of what was then the Western United States. So if this aspiration existed at the time, and if there was a longing for this kind of learning, even though there was an impediment in terms of time and the distraction of commerce and economic success. Then what happened to derail classical education in the United States? You and I discussed that when we were conversing about what you would talk about at symposium. What got in the way? What derailed classical education in America? I guess it was in the sort of early 20th century.
Yeah.
Why did we sort of leave it behind? What replaced it?
Yeah, it is it's an interesting story. And boy, it'd be great for you to have a symposium on that topic sometime, where we get several people speaking about it and really plumb the depths of it. But the short answer is that there were some revolutionary movements in the late 1800s and early 1900s that came upon the entire Western world, including the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the invention of sociology and psychology as disciplines, and here in America, massive immigration. Just lots of people coming with economic needs and in sensing the opportunity and coming for it. People coming who did not know English in large quantities. You mix all of these things into a pot, and you have a pretty heady recipe. I mean, for example, early 1900s, we'd put men in an airplane, start flying. We'd already invented the locomotive. than the car. If we could put people in an aeroplane,
Right.
and engineer cars at, in mass so that everybody could afford a car, couldn't we re-engineer education, and couldn't we apply the findings of science to the discipline or art of education, and couldn't we figure out what the laws of learning are, such that if we just could discover what methods to use, we could guarantee predictable results to anybody we educated? Could we not engineer schools and engineer students for their betterment and for the betterment of society?
Right.
That people were thinking this way, and yet, you have to read in the period to get a sense of it. It was a heady time. We really thought this was a progressive era. We were going to change the world. World War I was a shock to that, right? This was going to be the war to end all wars. And it turns out that, human nature is not as easily to re-engineer as we thought. Gilbert Hyatt writes a book in 1950. He was a professor of classics at Columbia University. And that's its own interesting story, because right across the street from Columbia University is the progressive leader of progressive education, the Columbia Teachers College. It was first called just the Teachers College, and then it was acquired by Columbia. But Gilbert Hyatt in his book says, The Art of Teaching, says, teaching is not a science. It's an art. It's an art that can be informed by science, can be blessed by science, but education is not a science, because human beings are not like machines that can be programmed. And so this starts, this debate continues, but essentially from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, there was a paradigm shift as to what education could be and should be. And it shifted from being an art that prepared people for human flourishing in all kinds of ways to a science that prepares people for jobs. It becomes job training to slot them into their right place, to where they are equipped based on their IQ, mental testing, and a predicted pathway, a track, if you will, where they can actually succeed and contribute to the burgeoning American democracy. That ideal won the day, and it did it in about 30 or 40 years. Alfred J. Knox, who was also a professor at Columbia, he chronicles this in his small little book called A Theory of Education in the United States, published in 1930 as a series of lectures he gave at UVA. And he says in the early 1930s, progressive education has emerged and conquered. And it is won. And he said, the old liberal education, what we now sometimes call classical education, he says, it's not coming back anytime soon.
So you beg to differ. We all beg to differ, I guess. And I think that's an important question. If progressives took hold of education in the hope that they could change human nature and redirect human nature, what accounts for the revival of classical education now? I have my own ideas, but I know you've been thinking about this a good long time, and that this will be part of your discussion or your conversation with the attendees at Symposium in February. What accounts for the revival of classical education, and why is this the right time for us to re-engage in that conversation, and to work at that revival and that renaissance together, at gatherings like Symposium, but informing a bigger and broader conversation and community? Why do you believe this is the moment for that revival in a broader sense? I mean, what I understand is that there are about, I don't know, what is it, about 700,000 classical education students in America, maybe about 900 schools. Why is this the moment for that, the sort of explosion of that number of schools, and why do we anticipate that it will only grow? And why is this the moment?
Yeah,
That's a lot of questions.
Well,
Sorry.
no, they're great
You don't
questions.
have to answer all of them. What are the most?
I love the questions, and I think we're, to some degree, we're hypothesizing. We don't know, but we have some ideas possibly why. And I would say a couple of things. One is the classical liberal arts education at the turn of the century, when progressive education was beginning to emerge, had calcified. There were, you can find examples of a kind of corrupted, stuck in the mud, complacent education. You can find that. Charles Dickens, for example, writing about it in Hard Times and so forth. There were some crustiness and calcification, ossification, even. Anything good can be corrupted. And so I don't want to pretend that, like, what I'm calling classical education, liberal arts education, was always just delivered with equity and love and benevolence and opportunity. No, of course there were corruptions, because corruption continues in every era to one degree or another. So there's that. So that's one reason why it rose. And then maybe we learned something about not allowing this kind of good liberal arts education to ossify. I'll cite C.S. Lewis as an example. He's very thankful for the classical education that he got, but he's critical of it too. And you can read about this in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. He did not like the beatings that he received in his British junior high school. He did not. The number of things he did not like. But he still, the goodness of the great books and the liberal arts and so forth still greatly benefited him. So we need to, remove the dross and keep the gold when it comes to our own tradition, and we need to critique that which we love. And so there's that. But I think another reason why it's coming back now is because progressive education hasn't done so well either in its promises and its deliverables. So 5 and 10 year cycles of reform and promised change have not resulted in promised change. And eventually people started to ask, what did we used to do? And people beginning really in the 70s and 80s to wonder if the progressive promises were really based on reality, human reality. And I think, following actually Alfred J. Nock, that there's a categorical mistake was made. We are not machines to be programmed. And if you approach human beings this way, and approach education as a science that involves simply the right application of method to yield, therefore, guaranteed results based on highly quantified assessments and test training and test prep and so forth, training and test prep, it doesn't deliver human flourishing and even the kind of skills that we really long for. And so people began to just ask the question simply, what did we used to do? And I remember asking the question myself, how was Lewis, and for that matter, Tolkien, how were they educated? How was Jonathan Edwards educated? How was Thomas Jefferson educated, and James Madison and John Adams? What, even George Washington, who wasn't as well educated, he sure did write well. He's had some, I loved his inaugural. Frederick Douglass, what happened to him that he could become one of America's greatest orators and not even receive a primary and secondary education? He had to get it on his own later. How is that possible? What happened? And so even in our own story, we see corruption, decay, ossification, exclusion, but recovery, and I would call it maybe repentance, a turning back to something good with the desire to give it to everybody. And so as we've turned back, we've seen that, just like Frederick Douglass did, there was something good that in the traditional education, when he read that book of great speeches that he had to steal,
right,
and discovered that there was a freed slave named Epictetus who argued that slavery was immoral and that he could be freed and that he deserved to be free, and that he could find this in the tradition, the liberal tradition of learning in the great books. So, boy, I'm meandering a bit, but I think the promises have not come true.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have asked the question, what were we doing before those promises were made? And it was by looking backwards that we saw this evergreen, never fading, never old liberal education that is a human education that has blessed countless generations of people, from the ancient times to up through the turn of the century. We could go back to it and find that it wasn't old at all because it was based in human reality.
Right.
So now we're recovering it, and we're realizing that as we're doing it, and we're fledgling at doing it, but we're realizing that if you teach students the liberal arts and the great books, the natural sciences, in the ways that have come down to us in the past, people will flourish.
Thank you. Well, I'm so excited for your keynote lecture at Symposium in February. But just before we left, I wanted to mention that you're also going to be leading a workshop with your co-author Carrie Eben of your recent book, The Good Teacher.
Yeah.
And I just thought maybe you could say a little about why you wrote this book now, and what the focus of your workshop will be. The subtitle of the book is 10 Key Pedagogical Principles That Will Transform Your Teaching. I know you can't talk about all 10 in a 60-minute workshop, but why did you write the book now, just briefly, and what will be the focus of your workshop?
Thank you for that question. The focus will be on trying to remember that pedagogy is an art that's based on principles of human and even cosmic reality, that we need to teach according to humans as they really are. You might say according to their nature.
Right.
And that there's some principles that have long been talked about that describe who humans are. And if we teach according to their nature, we'll be better pedagogues. And so we often say, Carrie and I, that, we're in this book, we're not saying a lot that's new. We're just trying to gather things that people have known for a long time and maybe put it in an orderly fashion. It's the list that we've gathered did not fall from heaven. There might be better, superior ways of organizing them. But it's good for especially new teachers to know these principles and to hear about them earlier rather than later. You'll discover them on your own if you teach for 10 years. For example, the first one is festina lente, which means make haste slowly. It's better to master each step as you're teaching something than to try to skim the surface and go too far and accelerate before you've mastered all of those fundamental things that need to be learned for future study. Right. So you may actually go faster if you ensure that you master each step in a sequence of learning. And carpenters learn this when they have to, when they quote to one another, measure twice.
Right.
So you only cut once, otherwise you waste your work. This was a dictum for the Roman army. They would prepare to the point of tedium, such that the name of the Roman army was exercitum, which meant a group of men who were always exercising, practicing all of their formations and battle plans, etc., and marching, and so that when they did go to battle, they would win very quickly.
Right.
So they practiced slowly and tediously so that they would win quickly and decisively. So, this is a cosmic principle, not just a principle for teaching. And so we want, in this workshop and in the book, we're trying to argue that principles should trump techniques. Yes, we need to use techniques, a particular way of doing something, of course. Carpenters have to use tools, and they hold the tools in certain ways, and you have to learn that. But there's a principle that informs the techniques. The principles are the first thing. The techniques are the second thing. But if you don't have the first things down, your techniques will not be properly ordered.
Right.
And you won't know what tool to use and at what time, and you won't really be free. So it's a principial approach to pedagogy, and we go through 10 of the more important ones that we think especially new teachers should master in order to get better faster, and to therefore be able to invent their own techniques, to know what to do and when, without having someone there to tell them, without needing someone there to tell them.
Right.
So that's what the workshop will do. And yes, we will briefly survey the 10, but we'll probably focus in on just a few to try to illustrate how principles should govern our techniques.
Well, that's wonderful. We're thrilled that you're going to be our keynote speaker at National Symposium February 25 through 27, 2026 in Tempe, Arizona. And to learn more about Symposium, please look for classicaleducationsymposium.org to register yourself and your schools, and we hope everyone will join us. Thank you again, Chris Perrin, for joining us for the On Classical Education podcast.
My great pleasure. Thank you for having me.